Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 3. The Journey to Ixtlan. Assuming Responsibility. Tuesday, April 1961. I arrived at Don Juan's house in the early morning on Sunday, April 9th. "Good morning, Don Juan," I said. "Am I glad to see you?" He looked at me and broke into a soft laughter. He had walked to my car as I was parking it and held the door open while I gathered some packages of food that I had brought for him. We walked to the house and sat down by the door. This was the first time I had been really aware of what I was doing there. For 3 months I had actually looked forward to going back to the field. It was as if a time bomb set within myself had exploded, and suddenly I had remembered something transcendental to me. I had remembered that once in my life I had been very patient and very efficient. Before Don Juan could say anything, I asked him the question that had been pressing hard in my mind. For 3 months I had been obsessed with the memory of the albino falcon. How did he know about it when I myself had forgotten? He laughed but did not answer. I pleaded with him to tell me. "It was nothing," he said with his usual conviction. "Anyone could tell that you're strange. You're just numb, that's all." I felt that he was again getting me off guard and pushing me into a corner in which I did not care to be. "Is it possible to see our death?" I asked, trying to remain within the topic. "Sure," he said, laughing. "It is here with us." "How do you know that?" "I'm an old man. With age one learns all kinds of things. I know lots of old people, but they have never learned this." "How come you did?" "Well, let's say that I know all kinds of things because I don't have a personal history, and because I don't feel more important than anything else, and because my death is sitting with me right here." He extended his left arm and moved his fingers as if he were actually petting something. I laughed. I knew where he was leading me. The old devil was going to clobber me again, probably with my self-importance, but I did not mind this time. The memory that once I had had a superb patience had filled me with a strange, implicit euphoria that had dispelled most of my feelings of nervousness and intolerance towards Don Juan. What I felt instead was a sensation of wonder about his acts. "Who are you, really?" I asked. He seemed surprised. He opened his eyes to an enormous size and blinked like a bird, closing his eyelids as if they were a shutter. They came down and went up again, and his eyes remained in focus. His maneuver startled me and I recoiled, and Ella laughed with childlike abandon. "For you, I am Juan Matus, and I am at your service," he said with exaggerated politeness. I then asked my other burning question. "What did you do to me the first day we met?" I was referring to the look he had given me. "Me? Nothing," he replied with a tone of innocence. I described to him the way I had felt when he had looked at me, and how incongruous it had been for me to be tongue-tied by it. He laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks. I again felt a surge of animosity towards him. I thought that I was being so serious and thoughtful, and he was being so Indian in his coarse ways. He apparently detected my mood and stopped laughing all of a sudden. After a long hesitation, I told him that his laughter had annoyed me because I was seriously trying to understand what had happened to me. "There is nothing to understand," he replied, undisturbed. I reviewed for him the sequence of unusual events that had taken place since I had met him, starting with the mysterious look he had given me, to remembering the albino falcon and seeing on the boulder the shadow he had said was my death. "Why are you doing all this to me?" I asked. There was no belligerence in my question. I was only curious as to why it was me in particular. "You asked me to tell you what I know about plants," he said. I noticed a tinge of sarcasm in his voice. He sounded as if he were humoring me. "But what you have told me so far has nothing to do with plants," I protested. His reply was that it took time to learn about them. My feeling was that it was useless to argue with him. I realized then the total idiocy of the easy and absurd resolutions I had made. While I was at home, I had promised myself that I was never going to lose my temper or feel annoyed with Don Juan. In the actual situation, however, the minute he rebuffed me, I had another attack of peevishness. I felt there was no way for me to interact with him, and that angered me. "Think of your death now," Don Juan said suddenly. "It is at arm's length. It may tap you any moment, so really you have no time for crappy thoughts and moods. None of us have time for that. Do you want to know what I did to you the first day we met? I saw you, and I saw that you thought you were lying to me. But you weren't, not really." I told him that his explanation confused me even more. He replied that that was the reason he did not want to explain his acts, and that explanations were not necessary. He said that the only thing that counted was action, acting instead of talking. He pulled out a straw mat and lay down, propping his head up with a bundle. He made himself comfortable, and then he told me that there was another thing I had to perform if I really wanted to learn about plants. "What was wrong with you when I saw you, and what is wrong with you now, is that you don't like to take responsibility for what you do," he said slowly, as if to give me time to understand what he was saying. "When you were telling me all those things in the bus depot, you were aware that they were lies. Why were you lying?" I explained that my objective had been to find a key informant for my work. Don Juan smiled and began humming a Mexican tune. "When a man decides to do something, he must go all the way," he said, "but he must take responsibility for what he does. No matter what he does, he must know first why he is doing it, and then he must proceed with his actions without having doubts or remorse about them." He examined me. I did not know what to say. Finally, I ventured an opinion, almost as a protest. "That's an impossibility," I said. He asked me why, and I said that perhaps ideally that was what everybody thought they should do. In practice, however, there was no way to avoid doubts and remorse. "Of course there is a way," he replied with conviction. "Look at me," he said. "I have no doubts or remorse. Everything I do is my decision and my responsibility. The simplest thing I do, to take you for a walk in the desert, for instance, may very well mean my death. Death is stalking me. Therefore, I have no room for doubts or remorse. If I have to die as a result of taking you for a walk, then I must die. You, on the other hand, feel that you are immortal, and the decisions of an immortal man can be cancelled or regretted or doubted. In a world where death is the hunter, my friend, there is no time for regrets or doubts. There is only time for decisions." I argued, in sincerity, that in my opinion that was an unreal world, because it was arbitrarily made by taking an idealized form of behavior and saying that that was the way to proceed. I told him the story of my father, who used to give me endless lectures about the wonders of a healthy mind in a healthy body, and how young men should temper their bodies with hardships and with feats of athletic competition. He was a young man. When I was 8 years old, he was only 27. During the summertime, as a rule, he would come from the city, where he taught school, to spend at least a month with me at my grandparents' farm, where I lived. It was a hellish month for me. I told Don Juan one instance of my father's behavior that I thought would apply to the situation at hand. Almost immediately upon arriving at the farm, my father would insist on taking a long walk with me at his side, so we could talk things over, and while we were talking he would make plans for us to go swimming, every day at 6 a.m. At night he would set the alarm for 5:30 to have plenty of time, because at 6 sharp we had to be in the water. And when the alarm would go off in the morning, he would jump out of bed, put on his glasses, go to the window and look out. I had even memorized the ensuing monologue. "I'm a bit cloudy today. Listen, I'm going to lie down again for just 5 minutes. Okay? No more than 5. I'm just going to stretch my muscles and fully wake up." He would invariably fall asleep again until 10, sometimes until noon. I told Don Juan that what annoyed me was his refusal to give up his obviously phony resolutions. He would repeat this ritual every morning until I would finally hurt his feelings by refusing to set the alarm clock. They were not phony resolutions, Don Juan said, obviously taking sides with my father. He just didn't know how to get out of bed, that's all. At any rate, I said, I'm always leery of unreal resolutions. What would be a resolution that is real then? Don Juan asked with a coy smile. If my father would have said to himself that he could not go swimming at 6 in the morning, but perhaps at 3 in the afternoon. Your resolutions injure the spirit, Don Juan said with an air of great seriousness. I thought I even detected a note of sadness in his tone. We were quiet for a long time. My peevishness had vanished. I thought of my father. He didn't want to swim at 3 in the afternoon. Don't you see? Don Juan said. His words made me jump. I told him that my father was weak, and so was his world of unreal acts that he never performed. I was almost shouting. Don Juan did not say a word. He shook his head slowly in a rhythmical way. I felt terribly sad. Thinking of my father always gave me a consuming feeling. You think you were stronger, don't you? He asked in a casual tone. I said I did, and I began to tell him all the emotional turmoil that my father had put me through, but he interrupted me. Was he mean to you? He asked. No. Was he petty with you? No. Did he do all he could for you? Yes. Then what was wrong with him? Again I began to shout that he was weak, but I caught myself and lowered my voice. I felt a bit ludicrous being cross-examined by Don Juan. What are you doing all this for? I said. We were supposed to be talking about plants. I felt more annoyed and despondent than ever. I told him that he had no business or the remotest qualifications to pass judgment on my behavior, and he exploded into a belly laugh. When you get angry you always feel righteous, don't you? He said and blinked like a bird. He was right. I had the tendency to feel justified at being angry. Let's not talk about my father, I said, feigning a happy mood. Let's talk about plants. No, let's talk about your father, he insisted. That is the place to begin today. If you think that you were so much stronger than he, Why didn't you go swimming at 6 in the morning in his place? I told him that I could not believe he was seriously asking me that. I had always thought that swimming at 6 in the morning was my father's business and not mine. It was also your business from the moment you accepted his idea, Don Juan snapped at me. I said that I had never accepted it, that I had always known my father was not truthful to himself. Don Juan asked me matter-of-factly why I had not voiced my opinions at the time. You don't tell your father things like that, I said as a weak explanation. Why not? That was not done in my house, that's all. You have done worse things in your house, he declared like a judge from the bench. The only thing you never did was to shine your spirit. There was such a devastating force in his words that they echoed in my mind. He brought all my defenses down. I could not argue with him. I took refuge in writing my notes. I tried a last feeble explanation and said that all my life I had encountered people of my father's kind who had, like my father, hooked me somehow into their schemes, and as a rule I had always been left dangling. You are complaining, he said softly. You have been complaining all your life because you don't assume responsibility for your decisions. If you would have assumed responsibility for your father's idea of swimming at 6 in the morning, you would have swum by yourself if necessary, or you would have told him to go to hell the first time he opened his mouth after you knew his devices. But you didn't say anything. Therefore, you were as weak as your father. To assume the responsibility of one's decisions means that one is ready to die for them. Wait, I said. You are twisting this around. He did not let me finish. I was going to tell him that I had used my father only as an example of an unrealistic way of acting, and that nobody in his right mind would be willing to die for such an idiotic thing. It doesn't matter what the decision is, he said. Nothing could be more or less serious than anything else. Don't you see? In a world where death is the hunter, there are no small or big decisions. There are only decisions that we make in the face of our inevitable death. I could not say anything. Perhaps an hour went by. Don Juan was perfectly motionless on his mat, although he was not sleeping. Why do you tell me all this, Don Juan? I asked. Why are you doing this to me? You came to me, he said. No, that was not the case, you were brought to me. And I have had a gesture with you. I beg your pardon? You could have had a gesture with your father by swimming for him, but you didn't, perhaps because you were too young. I have lived longer than you. I have nothing pending. There is no hurry in my life, therefore I can properly have a gesture with you. In the afternoon we went for a hike. I easily kept his pace and marveled again at his stupendous physical prowess. He walked so nimbly and with such sure steps that next to him I was like a child. We went in an easterly direction. I noticed then that he did not like to talk while he walked. If I spoke to him, he would stop walking in order to answer me. After a couple of hours we came to a hill. He sat down and signaled me to sit by him. He announced in a mock dramatic tone that he was going to tell me a story. He said that once upon a time there was a young man, a destitute Indian who lived among the white men in a city. He had no home, no relatives, no friends. He had come into the city to find his fortune and had found only misery and pain. From time to time he made a few cents working like a mule, barely enough for a morsel, otherwise he had to beg or steal food. Don Juan said that one day the young man went to the marketplace. He walked up and down the street in a haze, his eyes wild upon seeing all the good things that were gathered there. He was so frantic that he did not see where he was walking and ended up tripping over some baskets and falling on lap of an old man. The old man was carrying 4 enormous gourds and had just sat down to rest and eat. Don Juan smiled knowingly and said that the old man found it quite strange that the young man had stumbled on him. He was not angry at being disturbed, but amazed at why this particular young man had fallen on top of him. The young man, on the other hand, was angry and told him to get out of his way. He was not concerned at all about the ultimate reason for their meeting. He had not noticed that their paths had actually crossed. Don Juan mimicked the motions of someone going after something that was rolling over. He said that the old man's gourds had turned over and were rolling down the street. When the young man saw the gourds, he thought he had found his food for the day. He helped the old man up and insisted on helping him carry the heavy gourds. The old man told him that he was on his way to his home in the mountains, and the young man insisted on going with him, at least part of the way. The old man took the road to the mountains, and as they hiked, he gave the young man part of the food he had bought at the market. The young man ate to his heart's content, and when he was quite satisfied, he began to notice how heavy the gourds were and clutched them tightly. Don Juan opened his eyes and smiled with a devilish grin. Said that the young man asked, "What do you carry in these gourds?" The old man did not answer, but told him that he was going to show him a companion or friend who could alleviate his sorrows and give him advice and wisdom about the ways of the world. Don Juan made a majestic gesture with both hands and said that the old man summoned the most beautiful deer that the young man had ever seen. The deer was so tame that it came to him and walked around him. It glittered and shone. The young man was spellbound and knew right away that it was a spirit deer. The old man told him then that if he wished to have that friend and its wisdom, all he had to do was to let go of the gourds. Don Juan's grin portrayed ambition. He said that the young man's petty desires were pricked upon hearing such a request. Don Juan's eyes became small and devilish as he voiced the young man's question. "What do you have in these 4 enormous gourds?" Don Juan said that the old man very serenely replied that he was carrying food, pinole and water. He stopped narrating the story and walked around in a circle a couple of times. I did not know what he was doing, but apparently it was part of the story. The circle seemed to portray the deliberations of the young man. Don Juan said that, of course, the young man had not believed a word. He calculated that if the old man, who was obviously a wizard, was willing to give a spirit deer for his gourds, then the gourds must have been filled with power beyond belief. Don Juan contorted his face again into a devilish grin and said that the young man declared that he wanted to have the gourds. There was a long pause that seemed to mark the end of the story. Don Juan remained quiet, yet I was sure he wanted me to ask about it, and I did. "What happened to the young man?" "He took the gourds," he replied with a smile of satisfaction. There was another long pause. I laughed. I thought that this had been a real Indian story. Don Juan's eyes were shining as he smiled at me. There was an air of innocence about him. He began to laugh in soft spurts and asked me, "Don't you want to know about the gourds?" "Of course I want to know." I thought that was the end of the story. "Oh no," he said with a mischievous light in his eyes. The young man took his gourds and ran away to an isolated place and opened them. What did he find? I asked. Don Juan glanced at me and I had the feeling he was aware of my mental gymnastics. He shook his head and chuckled. Well, I urged him. Were the gourds empty? There was only food and water inside the gourds, he said. And the young man, in a fit of anger, smashed them against the rocks. I said that his reaction was only natural, anyone in his position would have done the same. Don Juan's reply was that the young man was a fool who did not know what he was looking for. He did not know what power was, so he could not tell whether or not he had found it. He had not taken responsibility for his decision, therefore he was angered by his blunder. He expected to gain something and got nothing instead. Don Juan speculated that if I were the young man and if I had followed my inclinations, I would have ended up angry and remorseful, and would, no doubt, have spent the rest of my life feeling sorry for myself for what I had lost. Then he explained the behavior of the old man. He had cleverly fed the young man so as to give him the daring of a satisfied stomach. Thus the young man, upon finding only food in the gourds, smashed them in a fit of anger. Had he been aware of his decision and assumed responsibility for it, Don Juan said, he would have taken the food and would have been more than satisfied with it. And perhaps Lai might even have realized that the food was power too. Becoming a hunter. Friday, June 23, 1961. As soon as I sat down, I bombarded Don Juan with questions. He did not answer me and made an impatient gesture with his hand to be quiet. He seemed to be in a serious mood. I was thinking that you haven't changed at all in the time you've been trying to learn about plants, he said in an accusing tone. He began reviewing in a loud voice all the changes of personality he had recommended I should undertake. I told him that I had considered the matter very seriously and found that I could not possibly fulfill them because each of them ran contrary to my core. He replied that to merely consider them was not enough and that whatever he had said to me was not said just for fun. I again insisted that, although I had done very little in matters of adjusting my personal life to his ideas, I really wanted to learn the uses of plants. After a long, uneasy silence, I boldly asked him, "Would you teach me about Payet, Don Juan?" He said that my intentions alone were not enough, and that to know about Payet, he called it mescalito for the first time, was a serious matter. It seemed that there was nothing else to say. In the early evening, however, he set up a test for me. He put forth a problem without giving me any clues to its solution. To find a beneficial place or spot in the area right in front of his door where we always sat to talk, a spot where I could allegedly feel perfectly happy and invigorated. During the course of the night, while I attempted to find a spot by rolling on the ground, I twice detected a change of coloration on the uniformly dark dirt floor of the designated area. The problem exhausted me, and I fell asleep on one of the places where I had detected the change in color. In the morning, Don Juan woke me up and announced that I had had a very successful experience. Not only had I found the beneficial spot I was looking for, but I had also found its opposite, an enemy or negative spot, and the colors associated with both. Saturday, June 24, 1961. We went into the desert chaparral in the early morning. As we walked, Don Juan explained to me that finding a beneficial or an enemy spot was an important need for a man in the wilderness. I wanted to steer the conversation to the topic of Payet, but he flatly refused to talk about it. He warned me that there should be no mention of it unless he himself brought up the subject. We sat down to rest in the shade of some tall bushes in an area of thick vegetation. The desert chaparral around us was not quite dry yet. It was a warm day, and the flies kept on pestering me, but they did not seem to bother Don Juan. I wondered whether he was just ignoring them, but then I noticed they were not landing on his face at all. Sometimes it is necessary to find a beneficial spot quickly, out in the open, Don Juan went on. Or maybe it is necessary to determine quickly whether or not the spot where one is about to rest is a bad one. One time, we sat to rest by some hill, and you got very angry and upset. That spot was your enemy. The little crow gave you a warning, remember? I remembered that he had made a point of telling me to avoid that area in the future. I also remembered that I had become angry because he had not let me laugh. I thought that the crow that flew overhead was an omen for me alone, he said. I would never have suspected that the crows were friendly towards you too. What are you talking about? The crow was an omen, he went on. If you knew about crows you would have avoided the place like the plague. Crows are not always available to give warning though, and you must learn to find, by yourself, a proper place to camp or to rest. After a long pause, Don Juan suddenly turned to me and said that in order to find the proper place to rest all I had to do was to cross my eyes. He gave me a knowing look and in a confidential tone told me that I had done precisely that when I was rolling on his porch, and thus I had been capable of finding two spots and their colors. He let me know that he was impressed by my accomplishment. I really don't know what I did, I said. You crossed your eyes, he said emphatically. That's the technique, you must have done that, although you don't remember it. Don Juan then described the technique, which he said took years to perfect, and which consisted of gradually forcing the eyes to see separately the same image. The lack of image conversion entailed a double perception of the world. This double perception, according to Don Juan, allowed one the opportunity of judging changes in the surroundings, which the eyes were ordinarily incapable of perceiving. Don Juan coaxed me to try it. He assured me that it was not injurious to the sight. He said that I should begin by looking in short glances, almost with the corners of my eyes. He pointed to a large bush and showed me how. I had a strange feeling, seeing Don Juan's eyes taking incredibly fast glances at the bush. His eyes reminded me of those of a shifty animal that cannot look straight. We walked for perhaps an hour while I tried not to focus my sight on anything. Then Don Juan asked me to start separating the images perceived by each of my eyes. After another hour or so I got a terrible headache and had to stop. Do you think you could find, by yourself, a proper place for us to rest? He asked. I had no idea what the criterion for a proper place was. He patiently explained that looking in short glances allowed the eyes to pick out unusual sights. Such as what? I asked. They are not sights proper, he said. They are more like feelings. If you look at a bush or a tree or a rock where you may like to rest, your eyes can make you feel whether or not that's the best resting place. I again urged him to describe what those feelings were, but he either could not describe them, or he simply did not want to. He said that I should practice by picking out a place, and then he would tell me whether or not my eyes were working. At one moment I caught sight of what I thought was a pebble which reflected light. I could not see it if I focused my eyes on it, but if I swept the area with fast glances, I could detect a sort of faint glitter. I pointed out the place to Don Juan. It was in the middle of an open, unshaded flat area devoid of thick bushes. He laughed uproariously and then asked me why I had picked that specific spot. I explained that I was seeing a glitter. "I don't care what you see," he said. "You could be seeing an elephant. How you feel is the important issue." I did not feel anything at all. He gave me a mysterious look and said that he wished he could oblige me and sit down to rest with me there, but he was going to sit somewhere else while I tested my choice. I sat down while he looked at me curiously from a distance of 30 or 40 feet away. After a few minutes he began to laugh loudly. Somehow his laughter made me nervous. It put me on edge. I felt he was making fun of me and I got angry. I began to question my motives for being there. There was definitely something wrong in the way my total endeavor with Don Juan was proceeding. I felt that I was just a pawn in his clutches. Suddenly Don Juan charged at me, at full speed, and pulled me by the arm, dragging me bodily for 10 or 12 feet. He helped me to stand up and wipe some perspiration from his forehead. I noticed then that he had exerted himself to his limit. He patted me on the back and said that I had picked the wrong place, and that he had to rescue me in a real hurry, because he saw that the spot where I was sitting was about to take over my entire feelings. I laughed. The image of Don Juan charging at me was very funny. He had actually run like a young man. His feet moved as if he were grabbing the soft reddish dirt of the desert in order to catapult himself over me. I had seen him laughing at me and then in a matter of seconds he was dragging me by the arm. After a while he urged me to continue looking for a proper place to rest. We kept on walking, but I did not detect or feel anything at all. Perhaps if I had been more relaxed I would have noticed or felt something. I had ceased, however, to be angry with him. Finally he pointed to some rocks and we came to a halt. "Don't feel disappointed," Don Juan said. "It takes a long time to train the eyes properly." I did not say anything. I was not going to be disappointed about something I did not understand at all. Yet, I had to admit that 3 times already since I had begun to visit Don Juan, I had become very angry and had been agitated to the point of being nearly ill while sitting on places that he called bad. "The trick is to feel with your eyes," he said. "Your problem now is that you don't know what to feel. It'll come to you, though, with practice. Perhaps you should tell me, Don Juan, what I am supposed to feel." "That's impossible." "Why?" "No one can tell you what you are supposed to feel. It is not heat or light or glare or color. It is something else." "Can't you describe it?" "No. All I can do is give you the technique. Once you learn to separate the images and see two of everything, you must focus your attention in the area between the 2 images. Any change worthy of notice would take place there, in that area. What kind of changes are they? That is not important. The feeling that you get is what counts. Every man is different. You saw glitter today, but that did not mean anything, because the feeling was missing. I can't tell you how to feel. You must learn that yourself." We rested in silence for some time. Don Juan covered his face with his hat and remained motionless as if he were asleep. I became absorbed in writing my notes until he made a sudden movement that made me jolt. He sat up abruptly and faced me, frowning. You have a knack for hunting, he said. And that's what you should learn, hunting. We are not going to talk about plants anymore. He puffed out his jaws for an instant, then candidly added, I don't think we ever have, anyway, have we? And laughed. We spent the rest of the day walking in every direction while he gave me an unbelievably detailed explanation about rattlesnakes. The way they nest, the way they move around, their seasonal habits, their quirks of behavior. Then he proceeded to corroborate each of the points he had made, and finally he caught and killed a large snake. He cut its head off, cleaned its viscera, skinned it, and roasted the meat. His movements had such a grace and skill that it was a sheer pleasure just to be around him. I had listened to him and watched him, spellbound. My concentration had been so complete that the rest of the world had practically vanished for me. Eating the snake was a hard re-entry into the world of ordinary affairs. I felt nauseated when I began to chew a bite of snake meat. It was an ill-founded queasiness, as the meat was delicious, but my stomach seemed to be rather an independent unit. I could hardly swallow at all. I thought Don Juan would have a heart attack from laughing so hard. Afterwards we sat down for a leisurely rest in the shade of some rocks. I began to work on my notes, and the quantity of them made me realize that he had given me an astonishing amount of information about rattlesnakes. Your hunter's spirit has returned to you, Don Juan said suddenly and with a serious face. Now you're hooked. I beg your pardon? I wanted him to elaborate on his statement that I was hooked, but he only laughed and repeated it. How am I hooked? I insisted. Hunters will always hunt, he said. I am a hunter myself. Do you mean you hunt for a living? I hunt in order to live. I can live off the land, anywhere. He indicated the total surroundings with his hand. To be a hunter means that one knows a great deal, he went on. It means that one can see the world in different ways. In order to be a hunter, one must be in perfect balance with everything else, otherwise hunting would become a meaningless chore. For instance, today we took a little snake. I had to apologize to her for cutting her life off so suddenly, and so definitely. I did what I did, knowing that my own life will also be cut off someday in very much the same fashion, suddenly and definitely. So, all in all, we and the snakes are on a par. One of them fed us today. I had never conceived a balance of that kind when I used to hunt, I said. That's not true. You didn't just kill animals. You and your family all ate the game. His statements carried the conviction of someone who had been there. He was, of course, right. There had been times when I had provided the incidental wild meat for my family. After a moment's hesitation I asked, "How did you know that?" "There are certain things that I just know," he said. "I can't tell you how though." I told him that my aunts and uncles would very seriously call all the birds I would bag pheasants. Don Juan said he could easily imagine them calling a sparrow a tiny pheasant, and added a comical rendition of how they would chew it. The extraordinary movements of his jaw gave me the feeling that he was actually chewing a whole bird, bones and all. "I really think that you have a touch for hunting," he said, staring at me. "And we have been barking up the wrong tree. Perhaps you will be willing to change your way of life in order to become a hunter." He reminded me that I had found out, with just a little exertion on my part, that in the world there were good and bad spots for me. He added that I had also found out the specific colors associated with them. "That means that you have a knack for hunting," he declared. Not everyone who tries would find their colors and their spots at the same time. To be a hunter sounded very nice and romantic, but it was an absurdity to me, since I did not particularly care to hunt. You don't have to care to hunt or to like it, he replied to my complaint. You have a natural inclination. I think the best hunters never like hunting, they do it well, that's all. I had the feeling Don Juan was capable of arguing his way out of anything, and yet he maintained that he did not like to talk at all. It is like what I have told you about hunters, he said. I don't necessarily like to talk. I just have a knack for it and I do it well, that's all. I found his mental agility truly funny. Hunters must be exceptionally tight individuals, he continued. A hunter leaves very little to chance. I have been trying all along to convince you that you must learn to live in a different way. So far I have not succeeded. There was nothing you could have grabbed onto. Now it's different. I have brought back your old hunter's spirit, perhaps through it you will change. I protested that I did not want to become a hunter. I reminded him that in the beginning I had just wanted him to tell me about medicinal plants, but he had made me stray so far away from my original purpose that I could not clearly recall anymore whether or not I had really wanted to learn about plants. Good, he said. Really good. If you don't have such a clear picture of what you want, you may become more humble. Let's put it this way. For your purposes it doesn't really matter whether you learn about plants or about hunting. You've told me that yourself. You are interested in anything that anyone can tell you. True? I had said that to him in trying to define the scope of anthropology, and in order to draft him as my informant. Don Juan chuckled, obviously aware of his control over the situation. I am a hunter, he said, as if he were reading my thoughts. I leave very little to chance. Perhaps I should explain to you that I learned to be a hunter. I have not always lived the way I do now. At one point in my life I had to change. Now I'm pointing the direction to you. I'm guiding you. I know what I'm talking about, someone taught me all this. I didn't figure it out for myself. Do you mean that you had a teacher, Don Juan? Let's say that someone taught me to hunt the way I want to teach you now, he said, and quickly changed the topic. I think that once upon a time hunting was one of the greatest acts a man could perform, he said. All hunters were powerful men. In fact, a hunter had to be powerful to begin with in order to withstand the rigors of that life. Suddenly I became curious. Was he referring to a time perhaps prior to the conquest? I began to probe him. When was the time you are talking about? Once upon a time. When? What does once upon a time mean? It means once upon a time, or maybe it means now, today. It doesn't matter. At one time everybody knew that a hunter was the best of men. Now not everyone knows that, but there are a sufficient number of people who do. I know it, someday you will. See what I mean? Do the Yaqui Indians feel that way about hunters? That's what I want to know. Not necessarily. Do the Pima Indians? Not all of them. But some. I named various neighboring groups. I wanted to commit him to a statement that hunting was a shared belief and practice of some specific people. But he avoided answering me directly, so I changed the subject. Why are you doing all this for me, Don Juan? I asked. He took off his hat and scratched his temples in feigned bafflement. I'm having a gesture with you, he said softly. Other people have had a similar gesture with you. Someday you yourself will have the same gesture with others. Let's say that it is my turn. One day I found out that if I wanted to be a hunter worthy of self-respect, I had to change my way of life. I used to whine and complain a great deal. I had good reasons to feel shortchanged. I am an Indian and Indians are treated like dogs. There was nothing I could do to remedy that, so all I was left with was my sorrow. But then my good fortune spared me, and someone taught me to hunt. And I realized that the way I lived was not worth living, so I changed it. But I am happy with my life, Don Juan. Why should I have to change it? He began to sing a Mexican song, very softly, and then hummed the tune. His head bobbed up and down as he followed the beat of the song. "Do you think that you and I are equals?" he asked in a sharp voice. His question caught me off guard. I experienced a peculiar buzzing in my ears as though he had actually shouted his words, which he had not done. However, there had been a metallic sound in his voice that was reverberating in my ears. I scratched the inside of my left ear with the small finger of my left hand. My ears itched all the time, and I had developed a rhythmical nervous way of rubbing the inside of them with the small finger of either hand. The movement was more properly a shake of my whole arm. Don Juan watched my movements with apparent fascination. "Well, are we equals?" he asked. "Of course we're equals," I said. I was, naturally, being condescending. I felt very warm towards him, even though at times I did not know what to do with him, yet I still held in the back of my mind, although I would never voice it, the belief that I, being a university student, a man of the sophisticated Western world, was superior to an Indian. "No," he said calmly, "we are not." "Why, certainly we are," I protested. "No," he said in a soft voice. "We are not equals. I am a hunter and a warrior, and you are a pimp." My mouth fell open. I could not believe that Don Juan had actually said that. I dropped my notebook and stared at him dumbfoundedly, and then, of course, I became furious. He looked at me with calm and collected eyes. I avoided his gaze. And then he began to talk. He enunciated his words clearly. They poured out smoothly and deadly. He said that I was pimping for someone else. That I was not fighting my own battles but the battles of some unknown people. That I did not want to learn about plants or about hunting or about anything. And that his world of precise acts and feelings and decisions was infinitely more effective than the blundering idiocy I called my life. After he finished talking, I was numb. He had spoken without belligerence or conceit, but with such power, and yet such calmness, that I was not even angry anymore. We remained silent. I felt embarrassed and could not think of anything appropriate to say. I waited for him to break the silence. Hours went by. Don Juan became motionless by degrees, until his body had acquired a strange, almost frightening rigidity. His silhouette became difficult to make out as it got dark, and finally, when it was pitch black around us, he seemed to have merged into the blackness of the stones. His state of motionlessness was so total that it was as if he did not exist any longer. It was midnight when I finally realized that he could and would stay motionless there in that wilderness, in those rocks, perhaps forever if he had to. His world of precise acts and feelings and decisions was indeed superior. I quietly touched his arm, and tears flooded me. Being inaccessible. Thursday, June 29, 1961. Again Don Juan, as he had done every day for nearly a week, held me spellbound with his knowledge of specific details about the behavior of game. He first explained and then corroborated a number of hunting tactics, based on what he called the quirks of quails. I became so utterly involved in his explanations that a whole day went by, and I had not noticed the passage of time. I even forgot to eat lunch. Don Juan made joking remarks that it was quite unusual for me to miss a meal. By the end of the day he had caught 5 quail in a most ingenious trap, which he had taught me to assemble and set up. 2 are enough for us, he said, and let 3 of them loose. He then taught me how to roast quail. I had wanted to cut some shrubs and make a barbecue pit, the way my grandfather used to make it, lined with green branches and leaves and sealed with dirt. But Don Juan said that there was no need to injure the shrubs, since we had already injured the quail. After we finished eating, we walked very leisurely towards a rocky area. We sat on a sandstone hillside, and I said jokingly that if he would have left the matter up to me, I would have cooked all 5 of the quail, and that my barbecue would have tasted much better than his roast. No doubt, he said. But if you would have done all that, we might have never left this place in one piece. What do you mean? I asked. What would have prevented us? The shrubs, the quail, everything around would have pitched in. I never know when you are talking seriously, I said. He made a gesture of feigned impatience and smacked his lips. You have a weird notion of what it means to talk seriously, he said. I laugh a great deal because I like to laugh, yet everything I say is deadly serious, even if you don't understand it. Why should the world be only as you think it is? Who gave you the authority to say so? There is no proof that the world is otherwise, I said. It was getting dark. I was wondering if it was time to go back to his house, but he did not seem to be in a hurry, and I was enjoying myself. The wind was cold. Suddenly he stood up and told me that we had to climb to the hilltop and stand up on an area clear of shrubs. Don't be afraid, he said. I'm your friend and I'll see that nothing bad happens to you. What do you mean? I asked, alarmed. Don Juan had the most insidious facility to shift me from sheer enjoyment to sheer fright. The world is very strange at this time of the day, he said. That's what I mean. No matter what you see, don't be afraid. What am I going to see? I don't know yet, he said, peering into the distance towards the south. He did not seem to be worried. I also kept on looking in the same direction. Suddenly he perked up and pointed with his left hand towards a dark area in the desert shrubbery. There it is, he said, as if he had been waiting for something which had suddenly appeared. What is it? I asked. There it is, he repeated. Look. Look. I did not see anything, just the shrubs. It is here now, he said with great urgency in his voice. It is here. A sudden gust of wind hit me at that instant and made my eyes burn. I stared towards the area in question. There was absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. I can't see a thing, I said. You just felt it, he replied. Right now. It got into your eyes and kept you from seeing. What are you talking about? I have deliberately brought you to a hilltop, he said. We are very noticeable here and something is coming to us. What? The wind? Not just a wind, he said sternly. It may seem to be wind to you, because wind is all you know. I strained my eyes staring into the desert shrubs. Don Juan stood silently by me for a moment, and then walked into the nearby chaparral and began to tear some big branches from the surrounding shrubs. He gathered 8 of them and made a bundle. He ordered me to do the same and to apologize to the plants in a loud voice for mutilating them. When we had 2 bundles, he made me run with them to the hilltop and lie down on my back between 2 large rocks. With tremendous speed, he arranged the branches of my bundle to cover my entire body. Then he covered himself in the same manner and whispered through the leaves that I should watch how the so-called wind would cease to blow once we had become unnoticeable. At one moment, to my utter amazement, the wind actually ceased to blow as Don Juan had predicted. It happened so gradually that I would have missed the change had I not been deliberately waiting for it. For a while the wind had hissed through the leaves over my face, and then gradually it became quiet all around us. I whispered to Don Juan that the wind had stopped, and he whispered back that I should not make any overt noise or movement, because what I was calling the wind was not wind at all, but something that had a volition of its own and could actually recognize us. I laughed out of nervousness. In a muffled voice, Don Juan called my attention to the quietness around us and whispered that he was going to stand up and I should follow him, putting the branches aside very gently with my left hand. We stood up at the same time. Don Juan stared for a moment into the distance towards the south and then turned around abruptly and faced the west. "Sneaky. Really sneaky," he muttered, pointing to an area towards the southwest. "Look. Look," he urged me. I stared with all the intensity I was capable of. I wanted to see whatever he was referring to, but I did not notice anything at all. Or rather, I did not notice anything I had not seen before. There were just shrubs which seemed to be agitated by a soft wind. They rippled. "It's here," Don Juan said. At that moment I felt a blast of air in my face. It seemed that the wind had actually begun to blow after we stood up. I could not believe it. There had to be a logical explanation for it. Don Juan chuckled softly and told me not to tax my brain trying to reason it out. "Let's go gather the shrubs once more," he said. "I hate to do this to these little plants, but we must stop you." He picked up the branches we had used to cover ourselves and piled small rocks and dirt over them. Then, repeating the same movements we had made before, each of us gathered 8 new branches. In the meantime, the wind kept on blowing ceaselessly. I could feel it ruffling the hair around my ears. Don Juan whispered that once he had covered me, I should not make the slightest movement or sound. He very quickly put the branches over my body, and then he lay down and covered himself. We stayed in that position for about 20 minutes, and during that time a most extraordinary phenomenon occurred. The wind again changed from a hard continuous gust to a mild vibration. I held my breath, waiting for Don Juan's signal. At a given moment he gently shoved off the branches. I did the same and we stood up. The hilltop was very quiet. There was only a slight, soft vibration of leaves in the surrounding chaparral. Don Juan's eyes were fixedly staring at an area in the shrubs south of us. "There it is again," he exclaimed in a loud voice. I involuntarily jumped, nearly losing my balance, and he ordered me in a loud, imperative voice to look. "What am I supposed to see?" I asked desperately. He said that the wind or whatever, was like a cloud or a whorl that was quite a ways above the shrubs, twirling its way to the hilltop where we were. I saw a ripple forming on the bushes in the distance. "There it comes," Don Juan said in my ear. "Look how it is searching for us." Right then a strong steady gust of wind hit my face, as it had hit it before. This time, however, my reaction was different. I was terrified. I had not seen what Don Juan had described, but I had seen a most eerie wave rippling the shrubs. I did not want to succumb to my fear and deliberately sought any kind of suitable explanation. I said to myself that there must be continuous air currents in the area, and Don Juan, being thoroughly acquainted with the whole region, was not only aware of that, but was capable of mentally plotting their occurrence. All he had to do was to lie down, count, and wait for the wind to taper off, and once he stood up he had only to wait again for its recurrence. Don Juan's voice shook me out of my mental deliberations. He was telling me that it was time to leave. I stalled. I wanted to stay to make sure that the wind would taper off. "I didn't see anything, Don Juan," I said. "You noticed something unusual though. Perhaps you should tell me again what I was supposed to see." "I've already told you," he said. "Something that hides in the wind and looks like a whorl, a cloud, a mist, a face that twirls around." Don Juan made a gesture with his hands to depict a horizontal and a vertical motion. "It moves in a specific direction," he went on. "It either tumbles or it twirls. A hunter must know all that in order to move correctly." I wanted to humor him, but he seemed to be trying so hard to make his point that I did not dare. He looked at me for a moment and I moved my eyes away. "To believe that the world is only as you think it is stupid," he said. "The world is a mysterious place. Especially in the twilight." He pointed towards the wind with a movement of his chin. "This can follow us," he said. "It can make us tired or it might even kill us." "That wind? At this time of the day, in the twilight, there is no wind. At this time there is only power. We sat on the hilltop for an hour. The wind blew hard and constantly all that time." Friday, June 30, 1961, in the late afternoon, after eating, Don Juan and I moved to the area in front of his door. I sat on my spot and began working on my notes. He lay down on his back with his hands folded over his stomach. We had stayed around the house all day on account of the wind. Don Juan explained that we had disturbed the wind deliberately, and that it was better not to fool around with it. I had even had to sleep covered with branches. A sudden gust of wind made Don Juan get up in one incredibly agile jump. "Damn it," he said. "The wind is looking for you." "I can't buy that, Don Juan," I said, laughing. "I really can't." I was not being stubborn. I just found it impossible to endorse the idea that the wind had its own volition and was looking for me, or that it had actually spotted us and rushed to us on top of the hill. I said that the idea of a willful wind was a view of the world that was rather simplistic. "What is the wind then?" he asked in a challenging tone. I patiently explained to him that masses of hot and cold air produced different pressures, and that the pressure made the masses of air move vertically and horizontally. It took me a long while to explain all the details of basic meteorology. "You mean that all there is to the wind is hot and cold air?" he asked in a tone of bafflement. "I'm afraid so," I said, and silently enjoyed my triumph. Don Juan seemed to be dumbfounded. But then he looked at me and began to laugh uproariously. "Your opinions are final opinions," he said with a note of sarcasm. "They are the last word, aren't they? For a hunter, however, your opinions are pure crap." It makes no difference whether the pressure is 1 or 2 or 10. If you would live out here in the wilderness, you would know that during the twilight the wind becomes power. A hunter that is worth his salt knows that and acts accordingly. How does he act? He uses the twilight and that power hidden in the wind. How? If it is convenient to him, the hunter hides from the power by covering himself and remaining motionless until the twilight is gone and the power has sealed him into its protection. Don Juan made a gesture of enveloping something with his hands. Its protection is like a. He paused in search of a word, and I suggested cocoon. That is right, he said. The protection of the power seals you like in a cocoon. A hunter can stay out in the open, and no puma or coyote or slimy bug could bother him. A mountain lion could come up to the hunter's nose and sniff him, and if the hunter does not move, the lion would leave. I can guarantee you that. If the hunter, on the other hand, wants to be noticed, all he has to do is to stand on a hilltop at the time of the twilight, and the power will nag him and seek him all night. Therefore, if a hunter wants to travel at night or if he wants to be kept awake, he must make himself available to the wind. Therein lies the secret of great hunters. To be available and unavailable at the precise turn of the road. I felt a bit confused and asked him to recapitulate his point. Don Juan very patiently explained that he had used the twilight and the wind to point out the crucial importance of the interplay between hiding and showing oneself. You must learn to become deliberately available and unavailable, he said. As your life goes now, you are unwittingly available at all times. I protested. My feeling was that my life was becoming increasingly more and more secretive. He said I had not understood his point, and that to be unavailable did not mean to hide or to be secretive, but to be inaccessible. Let me put it in another way, he proceeded patiently. It makes no difference to hide if everyone knows that you are hiding. Your problems right now stem from that. When you are hiding, everyone knows that you are hiding, and when you are not, you are available for everyone to take a poke at you. I was beginning to feel threatened and hurriedly tried to defend myself. Don't explain yourself, Don Juan said dryly. There is no need. We are fools, all of us, and you cannot be different. At one time in my life I, like you, made myself available over and over again, until there was nothing of me left for anything, except perhaps crying. And that I did, just like yourself. Don Juan sized me up for a moment and then sighed loudly. I was younger than you, though, he went on, but one day I had enough and I changed. Let's say that one day, when I was becoming a hunter, I learned the secret of being available and unavailable. I told him that his point was bypassing me. I truly could not understand what he meant by being available. He had used the Spanish idioms ponerse al alcance and ponerse en el del camino, to put oneself within reach, and to put oneself in the middle of a trafficked way. You must take yourself away, he explained. You must retrieve yourself from the middle of a trafficked way. Your whole being is there, thus it is of no use to hide, you would only imagine that you are hidden. Being in the middle of the road means that everyone passing by watches your comings and goings. His metaphor was interesting, but at the same time it was also obscure. You are talking in riddles, I said. He stared at me fixedly for a long moment and then began to hum a tune. I straightened my back and sat attentively. I knew that when Don Juan hummed a Mexican tune he was about to clobber me. Hey, he said, smiling, and peered at me. "Whatever happened to your blonde friend? That girl that you used to really like?" I must have looked at him like a confounded idiot. He laughed with great delight. I did not know what to say. "You told me about her," he said reassuringly. But I did not remember ever telling him about anybody, much less about a blonde girl. "I've never mentioned anything like that to you," I said. "Of course you have," he said as if dismissing the argument. I wanted to protest, but he stopped me, saying that it did not matter how he knew about her, that the important issue was that I had liked her. I sensed a surge of animosity towards him building up within myself. "Don't stall," Don Juan said dryly. "This is a time when you should cut off your feelings of importance. You once had a woman, a very dear woman, and then one day you lost her." I began to wonder if I had ever talked about her to Don Juan. I concluded that there had never been an opportunity. Yet I might have. Every time he drove with me we had always talked incessantly about everything. I did not remember everything we had talked about because I could not take notes while driving. I felt somehow appeased by my conclusions. I told him that he was right. There had been a very important blonde girl in my life. "Why isn't she with you?" he asked. "She left." "Why?" "There were many reasons." "There were not so many reasons. There was only one. You made yourself too available." I earnestly wanted to know what he meant. He again had touched me. He seemed to be cognizant of the effect of his touch and puckered up his lips to hide a mischievous smile. "Everyone knew about you too," he said with unshaken conviction. "Was it wrong?" "It was deadly wrong. She was a fine person." I expressed the sincere feeling that his fishing in the dark was odious to me, especially the fact that he always made his statements with the assurance of someone who had been at the scene and had seen it all. "But that's true," he said with a disarming candor. "I have seen it all. She was a fine person." I knew that it was meaningless to argue, but I was angry with him for touching that sore spot in my life, and I said that the girl in question was not such a fine person after all, that in my opinion she was rather weak. "So are you," he said calmly. "But that is not important. What counts is that you have looked for her everywhere. That makes her a special person in your world, and for a special person, one should have only fine words." I felt embarrassed. A great sadness had begun to engulf me. "What are you doing to me, Don Juan?" I asked. "You always succeed in making me sad." "Why?" "You are now indulging in sentimentality," he said accusingly. "What is the point of all this, Don Juan?" "Being inaccessible is the point," he declared. "I brought up the memory of this person only as a means to show you directly what I couldn't show you with the wind. You lost her because you were accessible, you were always within her reach, and your life was a routine one." "No," I said. "You're wrong. My life was never a routine." "It was and it is a routine," he said dogmatically. "It is an unusual routine, and that gives you the impression that it is not a routine, but I assure you it is." I wanted to sulk and get lost in moroseness, but somehow his eyes made me feel restless. They seemed to push me on and on. "The art of a hunter is to become inaccessible," he said. "In the case of that blonde girl it would have meant that you had to become a hunter and meet her sparingly. Not the way you did. You stayed with her day after day, until the only feeling that remained was boredom." "True?" I did not answer. I felt I did not have to. He was right. To be inaccessible means that you touch the world around you sparingly. You don't eat 5 quail, you eat 1. You don't damage the plants just to make a barbecue pit. You don't expose yourself to the power of the wind unless it is mandatory. You don't use and squeeze people until they have shriveled to nothing, especially the people you love. I have never used anyone, I said sincerely. But Don Juan maintained that I had, and thus I could bluntly state that I became tired and bored with people. To be unavailable means that you deliberately avoid exhausting yourself and others, he continued. It means that you are not hungry and desperate, like the poor bastard that feels he will never eat again and devours all the food he can, all 5 quail. Don Juan was definitely hitting me below the belt. I laughed and that seemed to please him. He touched my back lightly. A hunter knows he will lure game into his traps over and over again, so he doesn't worry. To worry is to become accessible, unwittingly accessible. And once you worry, you cling to anything out of desperation. And once you cling, you are bound to get exhausted or to exhaust whoever or whatever you are clinging to. I told him that in my day-to-day life it was inconceivable to be inaccessible. My point was that in order to function I had to be within reach of everyone that had something to do with me. I've told you already that to be inaccessible does not mean to hide or to be secretive, he said calmly. It doesn't mean that you cannot deal with people either. A hunter uses his world sparingly and with tenderness, regardless of whether the world might be things, or plants, or animals, or people, or power. A hunter deals intimately with his world, and yet he is inaccessible to that same world. That's a contradiction, I said. He cannot be inaccessible if he is there in his world, hour after hour, day after day. You did not understand, Don Juan said patiently. He is inaccessible because he's not squeezing his world out of shape. He taps it lightly, stays for as long as he needs to, and then swiftly moves away, leaving hardly a mark. Disrupting the routines of life. Sunday, July 16, 1961. We spent all morning watching some rodents that looked like fat squirrels. Don Juan called them water rats. He pointed out that they were very fast in getting out of danger, but after they had outrun any predator, they had the terrible habit of stopping, or even climbing a rock, to stand on their hind legs to look around and groom themselves. They have very good eyes, Don Juan said. You must move only when they are on the run, therefore, you must learn to predict when and where they will stop, so you would also stop at the same time. I became engrossed in observing them, and I had what would have been a field day for hunters as I spotted so many of them. And finally I could predict their movements almost every time. Don Juan then showed me how to make traps to catch them. He explained that a hunter had to take time to observe their eating or their nesting places in order to determine where to locate his traps. He would then set them during the night, and all he had to do the next day was to scare them off so they would scatter away into his catching devices. We gathered some sticks and proceeded to build the hunting contraptions. I had mine almost finished and was excitedly wondering whether or not it would work when suddenly Don Juan stopped and looked at his left wrist, as if he were checking a watch which he had never had, and said that according to his timepiece, it was lunchtime. I was holding a long stick, which I was trying to make into a hoop by bending it in a circle. I automatically put it down with the rest of my hunting paraphernalia. Don Juan looked at me with an expression of curiosity. Then he made the wailing sound of a factory siren at lunchtime. I laughed. His siren sound was perfect. I walked towards him and noticed that he was staring at me. He shook his head from side to side. "I'll be damned," he said. "What's wrong?" I asked. He again made the long wailing sound of a factory whistle. "Lunch is over," he said. "Go back to work." I felt confused for an instant, but then I thought that he was joking, perhaps because we really had nothing to make lunch with. I had been so engrossed with the rodents that I had forgotten we had no provisions. I picked up the stick again and tried to bend it. After a moment, Don Juan again blew his whistle. "Time to go home," he said. He examined his imaginary watch and then looked at me and winked. "It's 5 o'clock," he said with an air of someone revealing a secret. I thought that he had suddenly become fed up with hunting and was calling the whole thing off. I simply put everything down and began to get ready to leave. I did not look at him. I presumed that he also was preparing his gear. When I was through, I looked up and saw him sitting cross-legged a few feet away. "I'm through," I said. "We can go anytime." He got up and climbed a rock. He stood there, 5 or 6 feet above the ground, looking at me. He put his hands on either side of his mouth and made a very prolonged and piercing sound. It was like a magnified factory siren. He turned around in a complete circle, making the wailing sound. "What are you doing, Don Juan?" I asked. He said that he was giving the signal for the whole world to go home. I was completely baffled. I could not figure out whether he was joking or whether he had simply flipped his lid. I watched him intently and tried to relate what he was doing to something he may have said before. We had hardly talked at all during the morning, and I could not remember anything of importance. Don Juan was still standing on top of the rock. He looked at me, smiled and winked again. I suddenly became alarmed. Don Juan put his hands on both sides of his mouth and let out another long whistle-like sound. He said that it was 8 o'clock in the morning and that I had to set up my gear again because we had a whole day ahead of us. I was completely confused by then. In a matter of minutes, my fear mounted to an irresistible desire to run away from the scene. I thought Don Juan was crazy. I was about to flee when he slid down from the rock and came to me, smiling. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" he asked. I told him that he was frightening me out of my wits with his unexpected behavior. He said that we were even. I did not understand what he meant. I was deeply preoccupied with the thought that his acts seemed thoroughly insane. He explained that he had deliberately tried to scare me out of my wits with the heaviness of his unexpected behavior, because I myself was driving him up the walls with the heaviness of my expected behavior. He added that my routines were as insane as his blowing his whistle. I was shocked and asserted that I did not really have any routines. I told him that I believed my life was in fact a mess because of my lack of healthy routines. Don Juan laughed and signaled me to sit down by him. The whole situation had mysteriously changed again. My fear had vanished as soon as he had begun to talk. "What are my routines?" I asked. "Everything you do is a routine. Aren't we all that way?" "Not all of us. I don't do things out of routine." What prompted all this, Don Juan? What did I do or what did I say that made you act the way you did? You were worrying about lunch. I did not say anything to you. How did you know that I was worrying about lunch? You worry about eating every day around noontime, and around 6 in the evening, and around 8 in the morning," he said with a malicious grin. "You worry about eating at those times even if you're not hungry. All I had to do to show your routine spirit was to blow my whistle. Your spirit is trained to work with a signal." He stared at me with a question in his eyes. I could not defend myself. "Now you're getting ready to make hunting into a routine," he went on. "You have already set your pace in hunting. You talk at a certain time, eat at a certain time, and fall asleep at a certain time." I had nothing to say. The way Don Juan had described my eating habits was the pattern I used for everything in my life. Yet I strongly felt that my life was less routine than that of some of my friends and acquaintances. "You know a great deal about hunting now," Don Juan continued. "It'll be easy for you to realize that a good hunter knows one thing above all: he knows the routines of his prey. That's what makes him a good hunter. If you would remember the way I have proceeded in teaching you hunting, you would perhaps understand what I mean. First I taught you how to make and set up your traps, then I taught you the routines of the game you were after, and then we tested the traps against their routines. Those parts are the outside forms of hunting. Now I have to teach you the final, and by far the most difficult, part. Perhaps years will pass before you can say that you understand it, and that you're a hunter." Don Juan paused as if to give me time. He took off his hat and imitated the grooming movements of the rodents we had been observing. It was very funny to me. His round head made him look like one of those rodents. "To be a hunter is not just to trap game," he went on. "A hunter that is worth his salt does not catch game because he sets his traps, or because he knows the routines of his prey, but because he himself has no routines. This is his advantage. He is not at all like the animals he is after, fixed by heavy routines and predictable quirks. He is free, fluid, unpredictable." What Don Juan was saying sounded to me like an arbitrary and irrational idealization. I could not conceive of a life without routines. I wanted to be very honest with him and not just agree or disagree with him. I felt that what he had in mind was not possible to accomplish by me or by anyone. "I don't care how you feel," he said. "In order to be a hunter you must disrupt the routines of your life. You have done well in hunting. You have learned quickly and now you can see that you are like your prey, easy to predict." I asked him to be specific and give me concrete examples. "I am talking about hunting," he said calmly. "Therefore I am concerned with the things animals do, the places they eat, the place, the manner, the time they sleep, where they nest, how they walk. These are the routines I am pointing out to you so you can become aware of them in your own being. You have observed the habits of animals in the desert. They eat or drink at certain places, they nest at specific spots, they leave their tracks in specific ways. In fact, everything they do can be foreseen or reconstructed by a good hunter. As I told you before, in my eyes you behave like your prey. Once in my life someone pointed out the same thing to me, so you're not unique in that. All of us behave like the prey we are after. That, of course, also makes us prey for something or someone else. Now, the concern of a hunter, who knows all this, is to stop being a prey himself. Do you see what I mean?" I again expressed the opinion that his proposition was unattainable. "It takes time," Don Juan said. "You could begin by not eating lunch every single day at 12 o'clock. He looked at me and smiled benevolently. His expression was very funny and made me laugh. There are certain animals, however, that are impossible to track, he went on. There are certain types of deer, for instance, which a fortunate hunter might be able to come across, by sheer luck, once in his lifetime. Don Juan paused dramatically and looked at me piercingly. He seemed to be waiting for a question, but I did not have any. What do you think makes them so difficult to find and so unique? He asked. I shrugged my shoulders because I did not know what to say. They have no routines, he said in a tone of revelation. That's what makes them magical. A deer has to sleep at night, I said. Isn't it a routine? Certainly, if the deer sleeps every night at a specific time and in one specific place. But those magical beings do not behave like that. In fact, someday you may verify this for yourself. Perhaps it'll be your fate to chase one of them for the rest of your life. What do you mean by that? You like hunting. Perhaps someday, in some place in the world, your path may cross the path of a magical being, and you might go after it. A magical being is a sight to behold. I was fortunate enough to cross paths with one. Our encounter took place after I had learned and practiced a great deal of hunting. Once I was in a forest of thick trees in the mountains of central Mexico when suddenly I heard a sweet whistle. It was unknown to me. Never in all my years of roaming in the wilderness had I heard such a sound. I could not place it in the terrain. It seemed to come from different places. I thought that perhaps I was surrounded by a herd or a pack of some unknown animals. I heard the tantalizing whistle once more. It seemed to come from everywhere. I realized then my good fortune. I knew it was a magical being, a deer. I also knew that a magical deer is aware of the routines of ordinary men and the routines of hunters. It is very easy to figure out what an average man would do in a situation like that. First of all, his fear would immediately turn him into a prey. Once he becomes a prey, he has two courses of action left. He either flees or he makes his stand. If he is not armed, he would ordinarily flee into the open field to run for his life. If he is armed, he would get his weapon ready and would then make his stand either by freezing on the spot or by dropping to the ground. A hunter, on the other hand, when he stalks in the wilderness, would never walk into any place without figuring out his points of protection. Therefore, he would immediately take cover. He might drop his poncho on the ground, or he might hang it from a branch as a decoy, and then he would hide and wait until the game makes its next move. So, in the presence of the magical deer, I didn't behave like either. I quickly stood on my head and began to wail softly. I actually wept tears and sobbed for such a long time that I was about to faint. Suddenly I felt a soft breeze. Something was sniffing my hair behind my right ear. I tried to turn my head and check what it was, and I tumbled down and sat up in time to see a radiant creature staring at me. The deer looked at me and I told him I would not harm him. And the deer talked to me. Don Juan stopped and looked at me. I smiled involuntarily. The idea of a talking deer was quite incredible, to put it mildly. He talked to me, Don Juan said with a grin. The deer talked? He did. Don Juan stood and picked up his bundle of hunting paraphernalia. Did it really talk? I asked in a tone of perplexity. Don Juan roared with laughter. What did it say? I asked half in jest. I thought he was pulling my leg. Don Juan was quiet for a moment, as if he were trying to remember, Then his eyes brightened as he told me what the deer had said. The magical deer said, "Hello, friend," Don Juan went on. And I answered, "Hello." Then he asked me, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "Because I'm sad." Then the magical creature came to my ear and said as clearly as I am speaking now, "Don't be sad." Don Juan stared into my eyes. He had a glint of sheer mischievousness. He began to laugh uproariously. I said that his dialogue with the deer had been sort of dumb. "What did you expect?" he asked, still laughing. "I'm an Indian." His sense of humor was so outlandish that all I could do was laugh with him. "You don't believe that a magical deer talks, do you?" "I'm sorry, but I just can't believe things like that can happen," I said. "I don't blame you," he said reassuringly. "It's one of the darnest things." And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.